Okay, hello and welcome to this lesson on what was a year in the life of a peasant like, looking at what life was like for peasants after the Norman Conquest. This lesson is going to be particularly useful to you if you are an AQA GCSE history student and you're studying the Norman England module. The lesson is really geared to that specification quite nicely. However, it's also going to be useful for you if you're an EdXL or OCR GCSE history student and you're looking at the Normans, or indeed if you're Key Stage 3 and looking at the impact of the Norman Conquest, it will be useful to you as well. So to start the lesson, I suggest you get a pen and paper for yourself, write down this title and then these three key words. So first keyword is scythe. A scythe is a tool for cutting crops and it is pictured down there on the left. Sort of looks a little bit like what the Grim Reaper holds, if you've ever seen a picture of the Grim Reaper. Then we have got sickle. That is just a different type of tool that is used for cutting crops. And that's pictured there sort of in the bottom center of the slide, that curved shaped tool. And then finally, we have got a tithe. Now, a tithe is a 10% wealth tax that is paid to the church annually. So once per year, all of the peasants would have to give up 10% of their crops that they produced on the farm and give them over to the church. Just on the right hand side here, we've got quite a nice little graphic representation of the kind of the year round of what it would look like for a peasant in terms of the work that they were doing. And we'll go into some more detail about that now. So what are the destination questions for today's lesson? Where are we going? Where are we trying to get to by the end? Well, question one, we want to understand what a year was like in the life of a peasant. So we'd be looking at all the different patterns of work that they had, their leisure, their food and drink, and so on throughout the course of one full year. Second question is, how difficult was peasant life? And as we're going to see, this is actually a matter of debate within the scholarly historian community. There are different opinions on how difficult it was, and you will form your own opinion by the end of this lesson. One of the beauties of history is there's not always a concrete right or wrong. There can be good arguments for either side, provided you can back them up with evidence and reasoning. So let's start with an overview. Life for peasant children was really, really difficult compared to today. Perhaps you feel like you've got it hard, you've got a lot of homework, it's hard to manage yourself in this remote learning situation of the pandemic and so on. And certainly we all have our difficulties today, but it's not as bad as it was for peasant children during this time, as we're about to see. So as many as 1/3, so 1 in 3 peasant children at this time would never even make it out of infancy. So they would die as children. That means infant mortality was that high. If you did survive, you wouldn't be educated in school, and you would instead start working almost as soon as you could stand up and hold tools. You would start working clearing stones out of the farms and chasing birds away. And that would be from a really, really young age. So your life would be set out for you as one of working very hard very early on. The reason they needed to clear the stones was so that the tools, when they were farming, did not break if they hit a stone. Now, that might sound like a really small problem. It's just a broken tool, but that could be devastating at this time. If they didn't have the money or the right equipment to replace what they had lost, then that could potentially provoke starvation the following winter. So it was vital. Chasing birds, see if you can have a guess, actually. Pause the video here and bullet point down what you think. If you said it's because birds might have eaten the seeds, then you are absolutely right. So when they're there sowing seeds, it's no good if the birds come along and nick them all. They need to make sure that those seeds are sown and that they take properly and grow properly. This is not trivial for those peasants. It's a matter of life and death. And even when you got to adulthood, it's not like it really got any easier. Life could often be just as difficult for adult peasants. Now, the main thing that dictated the sort of life cycle of the peasant each year was actually just the cycle of the seasons. And the reason for that is you've got to remember the level of technology was obviously much, much lower than it is today. And so is the level of knowledge. This is not because the Normans were thick or people at that time couldn't think clearly. It was just because they were working from a lower starting point. So today we are able to have a much higher level of knowledge and technology because we're inheriting all of the built up knowledge of the past. The Normans being further back in time, that just means they don't have the luxury of access to that. And so they're working from a lower level. And because they've not got that high level of technology that we enjoy today, the forces of nature, like the cycle of the seasons, are much more immediately prominent in their lives than they are in ours. They've made much more of an impact. You could do very little about them. You sort of had to go with them. And that's what we're going to see in terms of the year in the life of the peasant. So let's have a quick knowledge check. Question 1, roughly what proportion of peasant children died during infancy? So infancy is childhood. Question 2, what kind of work did peasant children have to do? Question 3, what was the main force determining the kind of work peasants did at a given time? And question 4, why was this force so powerful at that time? So pause the video here, get your pen and paper out, write these answers in full sentences if you can, because that will mean when you come back to your work, it'll be really clear what you've been discussing and you'll remember it better. Pause the video, and then when we come back together, we'll have a look at the answers. So here we go. Question 1, it was about 1/3 of children that would die in infancy in the Norman times among the peasants. Question 2, the kind of work that peasant children would do was mainly clearing stones and chasing the birds away so that the tools didn't break and the seeds didn't get stolen. Question 3, the main thing affecting the cycles of their work was the cycle of the seasons. And question 4, the reason for the seasons being so powerful for them was that the level of technology and knowledge in Norman England was much, much lower than it is today. So let's have a look at what each season would have meant for the patterns of work for the peasants. Here we've got spring. Now, during spring, the whole sort of cycle of farming would begin, and they would begin by sowing the seeds. So putting down in the soil the seeds for the crops that they later hope to harvest. And there's an illustration there for you. Then we come on to summer. Summer is when you're going to harvest your crops as a peasant using 2 different types of tools. See if you can remember what they are. If you said the sickle and the scythe, you are correct. So you can see someone there using the sickle in the background to harvest their wheat. Now, the harvest could be good or bad. They would fluctuate. They would go up and down each year. And it was sort of a matter of luck for the most part, how well each one would do. If you had a good harvest, you'd survive nicely in the winter. If you had a bad harvest, you were under threat of starvation and indeed death. Then we come on to autumn. This is where they're going to plough the fields in readiness for the next spring when they're going to sow their seeds again. Now, what they ploughed the fields with, you can see pictured here. Basically, they used ox. So oxen would drive these ploughs in straight lines along the strip farms and get the soil nice and ready for seeds to be sown during the next spring. And then that just leaves winter. So winter, they couldn't do anything. They couldn't farm the land in winter because it was not possible. The cycle of the seasons made that impossible. So instead, all they could do was live from the food that they had stored during the summer's harvest. So how well they did in winter was determined half a year earlier when they harvested their crops. And as we said, the harvest fluctuating, the harvest going up and down, meant that this could be an extremely difficult time if they had had a poor harvest. So a quick knowledge check here. Question 1, what did the peasants do in spring? Question 2, what did they do in summer? Question 3, what did they do in autumn? And question 4, what did the peasants do in winter? As usual, just pause the video here, get your pen and paper out, and see if you can remember each season what they did, and then we'll come back together. Okay, here we go. So in the spring, they sowed their seeds. In the summer, they would harvest crops with a sickle or with a scythe. In the autumn, they would plough the fields with ox-driven ploughs. And in the winter, they would just survive according to the crops that they had harvested. Okay, so that is a peasant's year. We're now going to move on to a peasant's day. So what were things like just day to day for the Norman peasants? Well, they would start by waking up half an hour before sunrise. So let's compare that to when you got up today. Just have a little think in your mind and then compare it to when sunrise was, which I think would have been something like 10 to 7, something like that. The peasants would wake up half an hour before that. So let's call that 20 past 6 every morning. They would then eat pottage, which is similar to what we know as porridge. When the sun came up, they'd start working. So as soon as it was light, as soon as it was possible, basically, to start working, that is when they would start every day. The kind of work they did, as we've seen, depended on the season. So on a given day, it would depend what season it was as to what kind of work they were doing. As we've said, if it was spring, they'd be sowing. If it was summer, they'd be reaping, which is the word for bringing in the harvest. If it was autumn, they'd be ploughing using their oxen. And in winter, they'd be just trying to survive, trying to not die. Reaping, just to go over again, I know we've mentioned it, but it is worth maybe getting down. It's the word for when you harvest the crops that you've sown in the spring using the scythe or the sickle. Now, although the majority of peasants farmed, not all of them did. There was a minority that did alternative, different jobs. Some, for example, were millers who made bread, and some were brewers who brewed beer. Now, the millers, they were forced to use the lord's ovens to make their bread, and they had to kind of rent the use of those ovens, which is very, very expensive. They could have used their own tools. There was such a thing as hand mills, which they could have used to produce their own bread. But if they did this, they'd be heavily fined. So it was sort of a rigged game for the millers, really. The lords made sure that they were going to exploit those millers and get all the money that they could out of that work. Okay, so again, a knowledge check here, this time on the day in the life of the peasant. Question 1. What tools did the peasants use to harvest? Question 2. What did they eat for breakfast? Question 3. At what time of the day did peasants start to work? And question 4. What other jobs were there for peasants apart from farming? Pause the video here, get your pen and paper out, answer them in full sentences, and then we will come back together and check. So question 1, the two types of tool they used in the main were sickles and scythes to cut the crops and harvest them. Question 2, the most common breakfast was pottage, kind of like porridge. Question 3, they would start work at sunrise. And question 4, two common jobs that they would do if they were not farming during the day could be milling or brewing, so making bread or brewing beer. Okay, so moving on then to the kinds of food and drink that they had. If you're imagining that they could have had McDonald's, you are sorely mistaken. This is the kind of exciting food that they would get to live. Are you ready for this? So during the day, they would eat rye, which is a dry, hard bread. They would have their evening meal really late. And the reason they have it late is because they had to work until the sun went down. They start when the sun comes up, they stop when the sun goes down. When they get in and have that evening meal, it's mainly going to be of vegetables that they had grown themselves. In terms of drink, they'd often have home-brewed beer or cider. Now, you might be thinking, where's the meat? All that we've talked about so far is dry, hard bread, and we've mentioned a vegetable dinner when they get in from work. But they very rarely ate meat because it was just too expensive for them. The peasants were extremely poor, always living on the brink, really, of just subsistence, of getting by. So they didn't eat the meat. It was too expensive. And it was the same for sugar and fruit. They were generally just too expensive and too rare for the peasants to have any access to them. Really, they were mainly sticking to their bread, their pottage, and their vegetable dinners. However, they could sometimes, if they were lucky, find a little bit of honey locally. Now, that is all, as you might imagine, in stark contrast to the lord of the manor, who is there eating meat and fish daily, rubbing it in everyone's face. It's not like there was no access to meat and fish. It was just that it was restricted to the richest, to the lords of these villages, who would eat meat and fish every day. Now, interestingly, women had it particularly hard. They were only allowed to eat when their husbands and all their children had finished and she had cleared away the dishes. So even within the already harshly treated lives of the peasants, the peasant women had it even harder. Time off. Now, this is interesting because there's a lot of debate about this, even amongst professional historians. So some professional historians disagree actually with the AQA textbook. So that's quite an interesting thing. Now, the image most people have got in their mind, if they think about a peasant farmer at this time, is basically just constant, horrible, back-breaking work every day. No thanks until your life's over. A kind of a dawn till dusk, horrible, drudgery, hard work. But there are some people that doubt that kind of impression. Some historians suggest that it's a bit of a myth that peasants worked quite as hard as we imagine. So some historians say, yes, it was like that, except that the work would be broken up by long periods where no work took place, for example, during the winter or on holy days. They also claim that the average hours worked per year during this time could be around, oh, we've missed the figure in there, it could be around 1,500 hours. And that compares to in 1850, when the Industrial Revolution was happening in England, average hours were well over 3,000. So in some respects, you could argue that peasants were potentially working fewer hours per year than even we are today, and certainly less than British workers were in 1850. However, this is a matter of debate. What's not a matter of debate is that when they were working, it was very hard. So the hours were certainly very long. It was a dawn till dusk type of job. And they would only get during the week one day off. They would only get Sunday off. And their Sunday would be structured as church service first, and then they have some entertainment time afterwards. Now, you might be wondering, what could they do for entertainment? They're certainly not going to get their iPhone out and go on TikTok. They're going to have to rely on some more creativity. So here they are. See what you think to these. Entertainment took the form of shin kicking, pretty much what it says on the tin, cockfighting, or wrestling. And sometimes you would get a visitor would come to the village, a traveling musician or someone who had tamed an animal like a bear, and they would entertain the local villagers. Now, what made life difficult for the peasants? What were the main challenges that they were experiencing? Well, firstly, the freemen did have the freedom to farm for themselves sometimes, as we've discussed, but they did also have to do that boon work. Boon work was where the freemen had to work for the lord during harvesting and sowing times, but also potentially just when the lord required it. So there was a vulnerability to the freeman in that the lord could always sort of pull rank, could use his power to get the freeman to work for him. So the freedom that the freemen had was limited. Villains, the people below the freemen, they had even fewer rights. They had to work at least one day a week for the lord all of the time. And during harvest time, they had to work basically constantly for the lord. And the bailiffs and the reeves were there at all times to keep them in line, to kind of crack the whip and keep them going. Now, finally, peasants also had to pay taxes in the form of a tithe to the church. And what that is a 10% tax on all the farm produce for the year. As you might imagine, sometimes the peasants just did not have the money to pay for this. But if they didn't have the money, they weren't off the hook. It wasn't like they didn't have to pay the tithe. They would then just pay it in seeds or in equipment. And if that had to happen, then that could leave the peasants unable to fend for themselves the next year. If they haven't got any seeds, or if they haven't got any equipment, then they are stuffed for the next cycle of the seasons. And so it could lead to starvation, but nonetheless, the tithe had to be paid. It was non-negotiable, and the church would demand it. So, final knowledge check. Question 1, what kind of food was rare for peasants? Question 2, how many days per week did the peasants work? Question 3, what did peasants do during time off on a Sunday? And question 4, what was a tithe? Okay, here come the answers. So question 1, meat, fish, sugar and fruit were all really, really rare for a peasant to access, even though the Lord would have access to them. Question 2, it was 6. Question 3, church services and then entertainment was what happened on a Sunday. And this would be things like cockfighting, wrestling, listening to music from traveling musicians, or you could have the one about a tamed animal from a visitor. And then number 4, tithe is a 10% annual tax paid to the church. So final task for this lesson, I want you to have a look at this statement here. The life of a peasant was hard, miserable, and short. How far do you agree with that statement? I'd like you to write a short paragraph on it. And here is a list of keywords you may want to consider using. Oh, we've gone too far. So freemen, villain, tithe, boon work, and reaping. Take about 10 minutes on this. And then if you want to replay the video for yourself to check your answer, that would be a really good way of seeing how far you've come in this lesson. Well done for getting through the work on this today, guys, and good luck with the rest of your course.